this wedding!
If you've ever been trapped by someone who called your cage love, this story is for you. Stay close. The woman everyone underestimated is about to bring an empire to its knees. Subscribe, you won't want to miss the moment she takes her life back. Stop this wedding. Words sliced through the ballroom. Nobody moved, then the room exploded. What did she say? Did the bride just stop her own wedding? A champagne glass slipped from trembling fingers and shattered across polished marble. The orchestra stopped in the middle of a note. Camera operators abandoned their assigned angles and rushed their lenses toward the altar. Guests stood. Others immediately sat back down. Then the massive oak doors slammed shut. Heavy steel deadbolts locked with a metallic click that echoed through the grand hall. Nobody was leaving. Across the ballroom, one man slowly lowered his camera. The hired photographer, Park Kai. His heartbeat stumbled. He knew that voice. Zuriel stood beneath towering crystal chandeliers, breathing hard beneath layers of white silk. Politicians, billionaires, mafia bosses, international reporters, every powerful person who mattered had gathered to witness the wedding of the year. Instead, they watched the bride refuse it. "I will not keep silent anymore." Silence answered her. Then every eye turned toward Shang. One senator began to rise from his chair. Shang looked at him once. The senator quietly sat back down. Shang smiled, not anger. Not surprise, a warm, patient smile. He clapped slowly.
My beautiful bride is simply overwhelmed.
Nervous laughter spread through the audience. Shoulders relaxed. Several cameras lowered. Nobody knew that one forgotten promise between two starving children years past was about to challenge the most powerful man in Seoul. And before this story is over, you will witness the exact moment every person who called her invisible realizes they built their empire on the wrong woman. The mafia don walked toward Zuriel with effortless confidence, gently straightening her veil before adjusting the diamond necklace around her throat. His thumb brushed away a tear as though comforting the woman he loved, the perfect groom. Then he leaned close enough that only she could hear.
You exist.
You exist because I allow.
Because I allow.
Breathing stopped. An elderly woman in the front row lowered her eyes. A government minister swallowed without speaking. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody ever did. Then Zuriel ran. Not toward the locked doors, not toward the security guards, not toward the judges, politicians, or billionaires. She ran past every powerful person in the room, toward the lowest paid man in the building. Kai barely had time to react before she collapsed onto both knees in front of him. Her wedding dress spread across his shoes. 500 heads turned. 500 people watched. She reached into the folds of her gown, not for a weapon, not for a phone, for a tiny silver ring, old, thin. Almost worn smooth by time, she pressed it into Kai's shaking hand.
You promised.
Her voice barely existed.
You promised
You'd save me from this monster. Ballroom disappeared. Rain hammered against the rusted roof of a broken garage. A hungry Korean boy tore his final piece of bread in half. He handed the larger piece to a frightened Nigerian girl whose hands shook from hunger.
I'll protect you.
They sealed the promise with a shared bottle of water. The memory vanished. Kai stared at the ring. The ring he had searched 3 hopeless years to find. His fingers went numb. Across the ballroom, Shang's smile faltered, only for a heartbeat. His jaw tightened. He recognized the ring. Hidden behind a curtain of white orchids, his cousin watched silently. His satisfied smile grew even wider until he noticed Kai's expression. Then, for the first time that evening, the cousin stopped smiling. Shang did not shout. He did not panic. He simply looked down at Kai and Zuriel as though they had interrupted an ordinary business meeting. Continue. Nobody moved. The musicians stared at one another. The reporters forgot to breathe. The guests remained frozen. Shang repeated himself. Continue. His voice became quieter, far more dangerous. The conductor slowly raised his trembling baton. The violins resumed. One by one, guests lowered themselves back into their seats, pretending nothing extraordinary had happened. Only the relentless clicking of camera shutters refused to stop. Shang descended from the altar. Each polished step echoed across the marble floor. He stopped only a few feet away. His shadow covered Kai and Zuriel completely. Without looking away from Kai, he spoke.
Take her outside.
Take her outside. 4 armed guards immediately appeared. Kai instinctively stepped forward, placing himself between them and Zuriel. The guards hesitated, not because they feared him, because they were waiting for Shang's permission to destroy him. Shang smiled again.
The police
outside answer to me. His voice remained calm.
Answers to me.
Chief prosecutor answers to me. The largest law firms answer to me. He looked directly into Kai's eyes. Half the journalists in this room receive my money every month. Another slow step. So tell me. He leaned closer. How exactly do you intend to save her? Kai looked toward the locked doors, steel deadbolts, armed guards, no escape. Then he looked back at the tiny silver ring resting in his palm, the rain, the bread. The promise. Slowly, he removed the staff badge hanging around his neck. He stared at it for one final second, then he dropped it. The plastic card struck the marble with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent ballroom. Every camera flash erupted at once. Reporters pushed forward, guests whispered frantically. Photographer? Has he lost his mind? Kai calmly unhooked the second strap across his shoulder. His expensive camera slipped from his hands. It smashed against the polished floor. The lens shattered into glittering fragments, years of work. Gone in one decision, he stepped forward one step, then another, until he stood directly between Zuriel and Shang. He slowly raised both empty hands. If someone leaves this room in handcuffs, his voice never shook. Let it be me. A ripple swept through the audience. Nobody had ever spoken to Shang that way, not publicly, not and lived comfortably afterward. Even the guards hesitated. For the first time that evening, they looked to Shang instead of acting immediately. That single hesitation changed the atmosphere. Shang blinked, only once. His smile remained. But the platinum cufflink between his fingers slipped onto the marble floor with a tiny metallic click. Nobody had ever seen him lose control of even that much. Hidden behind the orchids, the cousin's face hardened. The ring, the photographer, the childhood promise. Pieces that were never supposed to meet had collided before 500 witnesses and dozens of live cameras. His perfect plan had developed its first crack. Zuriel slowly rose to her feet. She was still trembling, but she was no longer standing alone. Kai never looked away from Shang. I made a promise. Silence answered him. Then another camera flash. Then another. This was no longer a wedding. It had become the beginning of an empire's collapse. Outside the locked doors, more armed officers entered the building. Inside, Shang's absolute control had finally been challenged. The question was no longer whether Kai had crossed the line. He had. The real question was whether a promise made between two starving children could survive the most powerful man in the room. The silver ring lay in Kai's trembling hand. Shang couldn't stop staring at it. Neither could the man hidden behind the curtain of white orchids. The cousin's face remained calm. But inside, he felt the first crack in a plan he had spent 3 years building. Because that tiny silver ring carried a history that should have died long ago. It should have disappeared with the letters. The first letter never reached Zuriel. Neither did the second, or the third. None of them ever had the chance, 3 years earlier. In a dimly lit study, the smell of burnt paper hung heavy in the air. The cousin sat alone, sipping hot chamomile tea from a porcelain cup. A neat stack of unopened envelopes rested on the polished desk before him. Every one of them was addressed to Zuriel. Every one of them was written by Kai. Without the slightest hesitation, the cousin picked up the first envelope. He held it over a silver tray. A monogrammed lighter clicked. The paper caught fire. He watched it burn with quiet satisfaction. Ash drifted across the polished wood. A faint smile touched his lips. "Love makes kings weak, Shang," he said softly to the empty room. Trust is the first crack in every empire. He calmly fed another unopened letter into the flames. Power belongs to whoever fears losing it the least. Another letter burned. I am simply keeping you strong. By the time the fire died, 3 years of hope had already begun turning into ash. Kai never knew. He only knew that every desperate letter disappeared. Every phone call failed. Every surprise visit ended behind another locked door. Another disconnected number, another security guard smiling politely. She doesn't work here anymore. She has moved on. Please stop coming. At first, Kai refused to believe them. Then weeks became months, months became years, eventually. Believing the lie became easier than drowning in hope. He never stopped carrying the silver ring. He simply stopped believing he would ever find the girl who wore its twin. Now, she was kneeling before him in a wedding dress, begging him to keep the promise he thought he had already failed. But while Kai searched desperately for Zuriel had already been trapped inside Shang's empire. 3 years earlier, she entered the company as a quiet secretary whose name nobody remembered. Then came a fraud investigation. The federal government was threatening to seize the company's entire asset pool. Within the high-security boardroom, panic was absolute. Executives were shouting over each other, screaming blame. Before speaking, before deciding, before signing a single document or even breathing, Shang's eyes frantically searched the crowded room. He found Zuriel standing in the corner. Only after seeing her face did his racing heartbeat visibly slow, his shoulders dropping as he relaxed. He couldn't function without her. Zuriel quietly plugged in her laptop. While the tech directors had spent days frozen, she pointed to one single, forgotten transaction code buried deep in 7 shell corporations. She untangled the multi-billion-dollar trap, saving the empire overnight. The next morning, Shang stood proudly on the grand stage, accepting the roaring applause of the international investors and taking full credit. Zuriel quietly returned to her desk to type his next schedule. It happened again during a cyber attack. It happened again when a nationwide factory strike paralyzed production, until saving Shang's empire became her invisible, daily job. But instead of honor, a calculated, escalating rhythm of destruction followed her, with every single humiliation stripping away a piece of her life. First, her career was damaged when her hard-earned executive promotion was stripped away and given to a board member's nephew. She lost her professional purpose, leaving her empty-handed. But immediately, as she packed her files, Janitor Femi, the quiet man she had defended when an executive tried to fire him, swept past her desk. He didn't look at her, but as his broom brushed her shoes, he dropped a small, hand-folded note into her lap. "We see you, boss, asterisk it red." The next humiliation targeted her professional reputation. An executive intentionally threw boiling hot coffee across her desk in front of a major client, accusing her of incompetence. Her professional standing was gone, and old corporate friends suddenly disappeared, refusing to return her calls. Pain threatened to crush her, but the warmth of a sudden interaction restored her focus. A colleague's small child ran into the lobby and tightly hugged her legs, handing her a flower. The escalation changed danger, targeting her friendships and social life. The cousin leaked a false corporate scandal to the media, making her a public pariah. Her landlord instantly vandalized her apartment door with hateful graffiti and evicted her. Social invitations vanished overnight, rendering her homeless. Then her freedom was threatened. She was arrested for a corporate crime engineered by the cousin. Her bank accounts were entirely frozen, and her passport was seized by federal agents. She was left with absolutely nothing, but inside those concrete walls, she didn't break. She used her time to teach illiterate inmates how to read by flashlight, earning the absolute protection of the prison's toughest women. When she was released, she returned to the boardroom to claim her final files, only for a senior executive to openly mock her prison record while the directors laughed out loud, refusing to shake her hand. But as she walked out, Femi stood at the end of the corridor, holding the door open for her. He stood at attention and whispered, "Welcome back, boss. We know the truth." If her story of resilience is making you feel something powerful right now, drop a comment below and tell her she is truly seen, because somewhere tonight another woman is carrying the exact same heavy silence, and she needs to know that a single comment from a stranger can feel like a hand reaching back through the dark. The photographer's hand found Zuriel's trembling fingers for 1 solid second, just long enough for her to feel the warmth. Something shifted in the room. Kai looked at the childhood ring, his mind racing. What is the real origin of the silver ring, and why does the cousin fear it? The corporate board meeting after her release was its own special kind of cruelty. A senior director laughed out loud when she opened her mouth to present. Someone had already deactivated her security badge before she even reached the building door, forcing her to stand in the cold for 4 full minutes while a guard pretended to confirm her identity. When the scanner finally turned green, that same guard leaned in and murmured, "Welcome back, boss. We missed you deeply." It was the only kindness she received that morning. Shang sat at the head of the table, staring at his rings. 2 weeks later, a contract crisis threatened to bankrupt the entire empire. She fixed it. Silently. Perfectly. In less than 12 hours, that was the exact moment Shang finally connected every single thread he had spent years pretending not to see. Every success belonged to her. He panicked harder than he ever had in his life, because losing Zuriel didn't just mean losing a companion. It meant the total collapse of his kingdom. Instead of apologizing, instead of telling the truth, he trapped her using the ultimate contract disguised as devotion. He proposed on a random Tuesday afternoon across his messy desk. "Marry me," he said coldly, "and none of this legal trouble will ever happen to you again." It was a threat wearing a velvet ring box. Zuriel agreed. Not because she forgave him. Not because she believed his sudden professions of love. She had stopped playing his game months ago and had started building her own secret alliances, waiting for the exact night he would hand her the biggest stage of his life. She knew the wedding would be his ultimate public display of power, making it the perfect place to strike. The cousin watched the engagement announcement with total satisfaction. A married woman was easier to isolate and destroy. In his supreme arrogance, he smiled. He deeply underestimated the invisible network of loyalty Zuriel had built among the ordinary workers, dismissing them as mere background noise. He didn't know that Zuriel had spent 3 months in a prison cell learning exactly how patient real revenge could be. He also didn't know about the old snow coat. Shang still kept it folded at the very bottom of a locked drawer in his private office. The exact same coat he had wrapped around her shoulders in the freezing snow years ago, whispering, "I'll protect you." Some nights, alone in the dark office, he would take it out and hold it tightly, unable to explain why a piece of old fabric felt heavier than an entire global company built on steel. But Kai wasn't just waiting. He was hunting with visible, sharp intelligence. He spent weeks following the money trail, tracking suspicious wire transfers through old orphanage archives. He bribed a terrified retired caretaker, uncovering a hidden ledger. He spent nights in a burned-out county archive, piecing together fragments of corporate fraud. He was physically attacked in an alley, losing half his primary digital copies, but he recovered the physical backups from a forgotten storage room, putting the puzzle together piece by piece. Then, right before the Grand Council meeting, an impossible setback struck. Their main lawyer suddenly switched sides, bought out by the cousin. The master hard drives containing their financial evidence were completely wiped by a remote virus. The board members issued an emergency order refusing them a hearing. Everything was destroyed. Despair threatened to paralyze them on the very eve of their strike, but Zuriel didn't break. In the cold bathroom before the ceremony, she looked at her reflection, her hands shaking as she almost gave up. Then she remembered the shared bread, the worn silver ring, and Kai's promise. She wiped her face, her shoulders stiffened, and she walked back out. They were going to fight anyway. Across the city, in a dark office, the ruthless cousin picked up his phone, his voice completely flat. "It is time," he whispered to a shadow operative. "If all their primary evidence has been systematically destroyed, how will Zuriel survive the Grand Council meeting?" The final Grand Council meeting transformed into a devastating courtroom trial. The cold courtroom air felt heavy. Every major mafia leader, investor, politician, and journalist sat in the massive chamber. Shang sat at the center table, looking completely confident. Zuriel stood at the front of the room alone, presenting her remaining physical documents. Immediately, the cousin's replacement lawyer stood up, launching a vicious counteraccusation, presenting forged data that framed Zuriel for the entire corporate theft. The room turned hostile. Investors slammed their fists on the mahogany tables, demanding her immediate imprisonment. The head judge slammed his gavel down, his voice echoing off the high stone walls. "This evidence is compromised and entirely inadmissible," the judge announced coldly. "The charges stand. Remove her." A heavy, suffocating despair filled the space. Shang sat back, a triumphant sneer cutting across his face. Kai took a step forward, his breath catching, believing they had finally run out of time and lost everything. The trap was fully shut. Then a sudden disturbance broke the silence. The heavy wooden doors swung open. Janitor Femi marched right past the security guards, holding a battered maintenance tablet high above his head. Behind him, a massive crowd of workers, receptionists, drivers, kitchen staff, and the women Zuriel had taught in prison, poured into the courtroom gallery. "You can reject the paper, but you cannot silence the building," Femi shouted, his voice ringing with fierce loyalty. He slammed the tablet onto the center table. It was a live system feed the cousin had completely overlooked. One by one, the living witnesses stepped up to the stand under intense cross-examination. They provided matching internal logbooks, secret audio recordings of the cousin's bribes, and eyewitness accounts of Shang's fraud. Investors stopped shouting, the tide turning. The cousin's lawyer frantically claimed the timeline was fabricated. But that was the exact moment Zuriel delivered the final, irreversible blow. She stepped forward, calmly sliding a final encrypted audio file into the system, a recording of the cousin himself, detailing the exact fraud hours before it happened, a file she had saved until the perfect moment. She systematically dismantled their timeline using their own recorded words. Shang's perfect public image finally ruptured. He slammed his hands on the table, leaping to his feet, shouting frantically at the board to silence her. His voice faltered, cracking in raw panic as the entire room watched his complete loss of composure. The facade was shattered. Every corporate lie collapsed. If her triumphant journey has made you believe in the quiet strength of women who refuse to stay small, comment, I see her right now, because another woman needs to know her current silence isn't the final end of her story. Shang's downfall happened in brutal, agonizing stages. First, the council took away his executive authority, stripping his title. Next, his employees walked out in massive waves, leaving his desks empty. His elite friends turned their backs on him in the hallway. The federal agents marched in, seizing his wealth, his cars, and his global assets. Finally, his own young daughter, watching from the heavy wooden doors, walked straight past him, completely ignoring his outstretched hand, and tightly held Zuriel's fingers, stripping away his identity as a father. Later that night, a broken, completely defeated Shang returned to his empty, dark mansion. He walked into his bare office, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the old winter coat. He sat quietly on the floor, holding the heavy fabric against his chest in absolute silence, realizing the protective man who had once loved Zuriel in the snow had disappeared years ago, consumed by the phrase he used to weaponize. You exist because I allow. There was no forgiveness, only the quiet tragedy of self-destruction. Kai reclaimed his family's legacy through clean legal truth, restoring honor to his bloodline without bloodshed. Zuriel finally walked out of the Grand Council doors into the bright afternoon sun, her dignity restored, her identity reclaimed, and her freedom entirely earned. She didn't need a savior. Their story didn't end with fireworks or a grand declaration shouted for an audience. It ended with a quiet celebration of healing. If you've been carrying things you don't have words for, if you've been trying to stay strong while quietly feeling exhausted inside, I don't want you to carry that alone anymore. When Your Heart Gets Tired was written for moments exactly like these, not to tell you to move on, but to help you understand what your heart has been trying to tell you all along. If this story found you when you needed it, the book is waiting for you. If your heart needs that today, scan the QR code or check the pinned comment and description below. Months later, they simply returned to the old, broken garage where the childhood promise was born. The rain was tapping softly against the tin roof. There was no dramatic music, no speeches, and no applause, just peace. She looked down at the small, thin silver ring resting in her palm, its meaning transformed from a desperate plea for rescue into a symbol of her own unbreakable strength. She handed it back to Kai with a quiet, confident smile. You kept your promise, Zuriel said softly. Kai looked down at the ring, then up into her eyes, a warm smile spreading across his face as he shook his head. No, Kai replied softly. You saved yourself. He simply walked closely beside her as an equal partner into the quiet evening. The story doesn't end with a forced wedding. It ends with a woman walking into her own future, no longer invisible, no longer owned, and absolutely never to be underestimated again. Now that the empire has fallen, whose story will be rewritten next?